Welcome to Herbal Talks. I am Miss Green of Herbal Punk. Today we have the great pleasure to speak to our guest, Andrew Bentley, an herbalist with a clinical practice in Kentucky, USA, and an author of an ebook entitled Herbal Medicine in the COVID-19 Pandemic. Today we will be discussing asthma and pain, so stay with us. Hello Andrew, thank you very much for joining us today. How are you?
Good, thanks for having me.
Thank you very much, it's our pleasure. Andrew, you are providing a holistic care to your community and you also operating a mobile clinic, which is so amazing, such a great idea. And can you tell us more about yourself and how did you get into herbalism?
Let's see, I'm in Lexington, Kentucky. I grew up in Eastern Kentucky, which is the mountains, rural, very rural area. In the 70s and 80s, it was somewhat disconnected from the rest of the world. And herbal medicine was still very much what everybody used for, normal things. If it was something you didn't need to go to the hospital for, you probably treated it at home with herbal medicine. So I learned from my family, and my family have been doing herbal medicine for a long time, in some generations as a profession and in some generations not, but it's a tradition in our family. And so that's how I got started learning, was from my father and my grandfather, and also from the community that I was in. And then I moved to Lexington to go to college and have been doing herbal medicine here since the early 1990s. And that's basically how I got into it.
This is brilliant. Thank you so much for sharing it. So today we will be talking about a herb called Azna, and we will talk about pain as well. Mm-hmm. So from my understanding, everybody has experienced pain in their life, and acute pain is easier to identify and it's easier to be understood because it can be as a result of infection or inflammation or an injury or something acute short term, which can be potentially easier to resolve. Whereas chronic pain is more complex. And I was wondering if you could share with us your knowledge about the nature of chronic pain.
Pain is something that, most people experience as, if they live long enough, people have, things in their body that start wearing out, discs in their back, joints in their hands, weight-bearing joints and joints that move a lot, for instance, also muscles, things like that. So a lot of the time people will have slow injuries, things that, wear down over time, that are not from, necessarily from one specific moment, but from a lifetime of use. And a lot of chronic pain comes from that sort of thing. A lot of chronic pain is also work related, where people are doing things with their body that they're compelled to do out of economic necessity that they might otherwise rest and heal. But so a lot of the time people will have chronic pain as a result of occupational things. The conventional or the usual treatments that people get for chronic pain are pretty limited in their scope. People will either take something like a non-steroidal anti-inflammatory type of thing, like ibuprofen or acetaminophen, something like that. And that's, kind of limited in its effectiveness. And then if it's worse than that, a lot of the time people get prescribed opioids, which are addictive and have a whole host of problems of their own. And then in addition to that, they sort of lose their effectiveness over time. And so a lot of people don't get very satisfactory treatment from that. So that's why a lot of people end up coming to herbalists and to other holistic and alternative healthcare providers, is because they are looking for something beyond that limited scope. So there are a few different things that I would usually look at if I were looking at somebody with chronic pain, one of which that can be done to repair tissue, to increase circulation to injured areas, things like that, that would maybe help to fix the damage that's causing the pain. And then there are other things like anti-inflammatories. For example, ginger is a really good one. That it's strong. It's fairly, you can take it in large doses. Nobody has ever died of a ginger overdose, as far as I know. And they're, very safe and very able to be taken in a large enough dose where if you're not getting relief, you can take more of it. So a lot of the time people will actually get relief from these things that they wouldn't get from what people think of as stronger medicines, which, they're not as dramatic, and sometimes they're slower in their effect, but they can have over time a more pronounced effect, and they can be taken in large enough quantities to have a more definitive effect sometimes. So that's a couple of the strategies that I might use in chronic pain. Heat is also really helpful. It's not necessarily herbal, it's more physical, but heat can also be really helpful. And there's a treatment that I sometimes do that I learned when I was in Central Asia, called moxibustion, which is sort of like acupuncture, but with burning herbs held near different points. And I use a lot of that for chronic pain and for acute pain as well.
Brilliant. And are there any other herbs that people can use for pain management?
There are lots of them. So one broad class of herbs would be anti-inflammatory herbs that contain salicylates. Willow is a really well-known example. Willow bark. Violets, which are blooming right now where I live. Spring flower, I make them into violet syrup, which is really useful remedy to have around, and it's something that I use a lot of. And so that those are salicylate containing herbs. They reduce inflammation and they reduce pain. There are also, I mentioned ginger. Turmeric is very closely related. Galangal is another one. These are all similar herbs that they sort of interrupt the chain reaction of chemical reactions that lead to pain. So they can interrupt the pain and inflammation process by blocking the action of an enzyme that's part of that chain reaction. And so those are that applies to quite a few herbs that are not salicylate containing, but that are pain relieving. And spicy herbs in general, we usually help with circulation and often pain along with it. So that's another good thing to know about.
Thank you.
We'll talk more about the Usnea in a minute, but that is definitely an herb that I like a lot for pain as well.
Can't wait to hear about it. And what advice would you give to people who are suffering with chronic pain?
I would definitely try to go to somebody who's going to have a holistic approach to it if you can, if that's available to you. Avoiding making it worse is one of the biggest challenges because, like I said, a lot of the time it's occupational or something like that, or it's just from, a weight-bearing joint that gets used whenever you're standing and walking and so forth. But I think that for the most part, movement is good if you do it carefully, and getting lots of antioxidants in your diet is helpful sometimes. And then, finding, I would say, like, taking a lot of a weak herb is often better than a little bit of a strong one for chronic conditions. So, a lot of the time we have this tendency to want something that's like powerful and dramatic and has a big, quick effect. And that can be great, but it doesn't necessarily last. And so you also might need something that's, a little more well tolerated and able to be done long term without causing other problems.
Thank you. And just going back to the movement, when you said, I'm currently studying biomedicine and I have been studying a skeletal system, and very interestingly, when someone has osteoporosis or osteopenia, the losing density of the bone, it is actually advisable to move, because when you move, when you're doing a physical exercise and when you press your foot on the ground, such as walking or when you're running, or even just walking, because people experience pain, so probably they can't run, but even walking or walking in the water, for example, can be really good, because that will then stimulate certain cells in your bones and make the bones stronger.
Right. Yes.
Yeah.
It's very, very important. Our bodies are made to be used, and if we don't use them, they sort of atrophy, or they get weaker.
That's so true. That's so true. Okay, so now let's discuss a little bit about Azna. So could you give us a little brief introduction about this herb, please?
Sure. It is what we call an epiphyte, which means that it grows on other plants, especially it grows on the branches of trees. It tends to grow in places, it tends not to grow in places that have a lot of air pollution. So it grows in places that have cleaner air for the most part. Here in Kentucky, it's not a super common plant, but if you get into further northern climes, you get more of it. It likes dampness, it likes a lot of fog and that sort of thing. So it tends to be found growing on the branches of trees, and it's sort of a long grayish green, looks sort of like, people call it old man's beard or tree beard, because that's kind of what it looks like as far as its texture goes. And what it is an organism that consists of fungal tissue and algal tissue functioning together as a single organism. So it's got two completely separate sets of DNA, and from two vastly different areas of the realm of living things. One is in a different kingdom than the other, you might say, and but they work together as though they're a single organism, and they have structures that consist of both kinds of cells together. And so because of that, they produce some things that you would normally find in mushrooms, some polysaccharides, for example, that support the immune system. They also contain some things that would normally be in algae, like the photosynthetic compounds. And then they contain some substances that you only find in lichens. And one of those substances is called usnic acid. And usnic acid gives it a sort of an acrid taste, and is responsible for some of its medicinal properties. It's also kind of the substance in it that's gotten the most research done about it. So it might be that we attribute more of its properties to that than is really fair. A lot of the time they're probably complex, but usnic acid, it kills bacteria, and it inhibits the replication of a lot of viruses, at least in a petri dish. We don't know that it necessarily does that in the human body, but it seems to have some antiviral properties, and it definitely kills other funguses. So it's kind of probably what the Usnea wants it for, is to keep other funguses from growing where it's trying to grow. But it's got a broad range of anti-infective properties in the human body. And so I use it a lot for that sort of thing, mostly as an internal medicine. Then, that, along with the immune supporting compounds from the mushroom part of it, from the fungal part of its body, make it a really good immune support. So it's probably, this last year, I would say it's the herb that I've used the most of, because we've had this viral pandemic going on, and I've made a lot of it here in the clinic, given a lot of it out through my community outreach stuff that I'm doing, and often along in combination with other herbs. But it's a really good immune supporting, anti-infective kind of thing, and I love it for that and use it all the time.
Fantastic. And how do you consume it? You mentioned internally, but is it in the form of tincture or infusion? What simple remedies would you recommend that we can do ourselves at home?
Tincture is really good. There's also, for the immune support, what I usually use is a tincture. And the way that I make that tincture is that it's a little bit more complicated than regular tinctures, but I take the dried Usnea and soak it in vodka overnight. And then I take it out of the vodka and boil it in water, and then combine the water and the vodka together and then let it steep for a few weeks. And so the hot water takes out some substances that the alcohol by itself won't take out, the polysaccharides, the immune supporting carbohydrate compounds that are in it. And then the alcohol takes out things, well, and also helps to solubilize things like the resin that are in it, which would not come out so well in the water. And so that liquid form is how I use it for most internal stuff. There's another remedy that I make out of Usnea, which is an oil infusion, where it's just basically you put the Usnea in some oil, bring it to a simmer, and then let it sit for several hours. And you get nice mossy tasting oil, and it's very good for pain topically. And I keep that when I'm doing mobile clinic stuff. I usually keep some of that around for tooth pain, because that's something that if I'm working with, a lot of the time with the mobile clinic, I'm either working with unhoused people or people that don't have access to medical care because they don't have money, or I'm at festivals where people are doing physical stuff. And so dental injuries and mouth pain can be, it can really ruin your day. But the Usnea oil topically for that, it's not spicy. It just has a little bit of a mossy taste to it, and it just kind of makes the pain go away without numbing. And so it's really useful for that, and it works in some really extreme cases too. It's very strong, a very reliable remedy for that. So I keep some of that around, and it's good for other pain as well. It's good for other topical pain. So that's a nice household remedy to keep around.
Wow, this is great. Thank you so much. And I might ask, maybe it's a silly question, I don't know, but can you take the infused oil internally, like under your tongue, for example, or is it purely to be applied topically?
You can take it internally. It works more dramatically when you take it topically, but if you do take it internally for pain, it does work systemically as well.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. You have written an ebook called Yes, so this ebook is entitled Herbal Medicine in the COVID-19 Pandemic. I actually had a peek at it, and I find it astonishing and fascinating, different recipes. I haven't read it all, but it looks really, really good. And can you tell us more, and what inspired you to write this book?
What inspired me to write it was that there was this big pandemic going on, and there still is. And I wrote it in November, came out in December. So wrote it in November and December. And at the time, cases here were very high. They're back down somewhat now, but I just felt like there was not a lot of reliable and information about herbal medicine for it, but it was kind of scattered all over the place. And I wanted to kind of consolidate that some. And there was a lot of information out there that was just purely speculative, that was being put out by people who were saying, theoretically, we think this might be useful for it, but they weren't coming from the position that I was, of having worked with hundreds of people who had the condition already. And so in October, I was part of a panel for the American Herbalist Guild's Symposium, which was being held virtually that year, where we were discussing, I was one of the panelists talking about COVID-19. And of the three of us, I was the only one that was actively working with patients at the time. And so I felt like this is an unmet need, that there should be something out here for herbal practitioners as well as other people who use herbal medicine for their own purposes, to be able to know what they can do to kind of help themselves with the condition. Because for a lot of people, it is a fairly self-limiting but very unpleasant condition that's very conducive to treatment at home. You don't want to go to the hospital with it if you can avoid that, because they've got enough problems already. And you don't want to just lay there and do nothing and feel miserable for 2 weeks. So this kind of helps to fill in that gap between, when you're not in the ICU on a ventilator, but you're not perfectly well either. So there's a lot that can be done in between. And so that's what I was trying to cover in the book. And there's a lot about Usnea in it. It's features prominently in the strategies that I've been using for people who have this situation. And there are lots of references to academic work, pages and pages of references, but it's all written in what I hope is fairly accessible language, plain language. And so it's, maybe not the most exciting read ever, but I thought that it was relevant for what was going on.
It's really good, and I think it's something that people need, a guide and remedies, how they can help themselves naturally, not necessarily, as you said, going to the hospitals unless it's an emergency, of course. And is there anything else you'd like to share with us?
Well, I feel like I should mention that I'm currently working on a book about medicinal lichens, which will also include Usnea and several others. I don't think there's a very good guide for using lichens medicinally. Some of them are mentioned in some other herb books, but there are maybe like 3 or 4 of them that ever get noticed. And I think that lichens are everywhere, and it would be wonderful for people to know more about them. So I'm trying to share some of the information that I've learned about them.
And what is lichen? I'm sorry to be an ignorant, but I don't know.
Lichens are organisms like Usnea that are part fungus and part algae. So they're kind of, they usually either grow on rocks or on trees or something like that, but they're a combination of fungal and algal tissue growing together.
Wow! And just being advised by the director, when you get the book done, it will be lovely to do another interview and talk about that book as well. So when can we expect this book to come to light?
Well, I'm still talking with a publisher about it, so I'm not exactly sure. I'm hoping to have my part of it done this summer or so, maybe August. But, I don't know how long the publisher's part of things will take. And yeah, that's one of 2 writing projects that I have going on. The other one that I don't really have a publisher for yet, and probably will end up self-publishing, I think, is an Irish language herbal medicine book, because we don't have a good herbal medicine book in the Irish language right now. So I'm working on writing that.
Yeah, fingers crossed. Going back to Usnea as well, would you recommend a place or where would be a best source to obtain the herb if it's not natural? For example, where we live in London, we don't have Usnea available, not that I know of. So if we want to buy, or any people that want to buy the herb, where would you recommend that we go and buy it?
I am really not sure who sells it, because I don't really buy very many herbs for my practice. I usually either gather them myself or have someone that I know of personally gather it for me. So I'm not exactly sure. I think that, you would want to be careful about where you're getting it from as far as sustainability goes, though. So, I would definitely try to see if you can get it from either an herbalist who's local to somewhere that it's abundant, like, for example, the Pacific Northwest here in the United States has a lot more of it than where I live. So I have someone that I know out there who goes and gathers it for me. And so, maybe finding someone who's local, like an herbalist who's local to that area, would be a good way to do it. Or, there are a few companies that probably, like, I don't know if they have it, but companies like Frontier and Mountain Rose that mostly are pretty good about sustainability. But yeah, it is definitely something that, because it is a wild plant, it's not grown on farms or whatever, it is something that, over harvesting is a potential problem for. and it can take a really long time to grow depending on its growing conditions. So,
thank you. And what general advice would you give to the public about health?
well, I would definitely advise them to, for the most part, recognize that it's mostly up to you to take care of it, and that it all starts with nutrition, and that movement and exercise are really important, and that prevention is much better than treatment, if at all possible. Those would be the most general things I could say.
Thank you. And how can people get in touch with you, Andrew?
Let's see. I am on Instagram under the username of Clinical Herbalist. That's a good way to find me. I have a website, KentuckyHerbalist.com, and also on YouTube under the name of Clinical Herbalist as well.
Thank you, Andrew. It was an absolute pleasure speaking to you. And again, thank you so much for giving us your time to share your wonderful knowledge, and really appreciate.
Thank you so much for setting this up.
Thank you. It's been great. It's been a great learning journey, and myself, I am an aspiring herbalist. I want to become a herbalist, so it's a wonderful journey to speak to senior, experienced people as yourself, and I'm very grateful for the advice, genuinely. So now I know a little more about Azna. Thank you so much. And please stay in touch once you get your book done. We would love to hear about it. We would love to interview you again and talk about the book.
Good. Thanks so much.
If you enjoyed our herbal talks, please subscribe to our channel, Herbal Punk.